Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm speaking with Sean Gallimore. Hey, Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, absolutely. So before we jump into our topic for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
So, Sean Gallimore, I'm an executive consultant at the current time. I've got a rich MedTech background with big blue chip companies, Medtronic, Johnson& Johnson, Smith& Nephew, Philips. Also in life sciences with Par Excel, and then for the last couple of years, a blend between MedTech and industrial tech. And for the last year or so, I've been consulting with early stage startup companies in the MedTech space.
Okay, excellent. So what are we talking about today?
So the topic is how can medtech leaders build high performance teams, preserve culture during change, and align mission and metrics while navigating the mounting pressures of growth, regulation, and talent competition?
Okay. Well, that is a loaded topic. There's a lot to get into there. What's your initial reaction from that topic that we're going to go over today? What's the overarching theme that you'd like to go into?
Well, I think leaders in the medtech space need to blend a couple of disciplines very well in order to charter their companies through growth or whatever challenge they're trying to face, while motivating their teams, recruiting the best teams, but getting them to perform in a way that actually is inspirational. It actually hits the value propositions of the businesses, but also navigates some tricky waters in terms of regulatory challenges, market dynamics, and the war on talent.
Mm. Well, there's a lot to unpack. What do you think are some of the essential characteristics of high-performing teams?
In general, especially in the med tech space, high performing teams need to kind of thread the needle between, clinical rigor, operational rigor, strategic rigor, commercial rigor, but also be in compliance with regulatory mandates and market dynamics. The teams that do that well do that in a very symbiotic way, not too many silos per se, and the talent's kind of run very, very well. I think the ones that also particularly go above and beyond have good partnerships cross-functionally. They seem to figure out how to work across domains, across functions very well in a ways that align towards a common goal. From my own experience, I kind of have a couple of frameworks that I tend to lead, I tend to use when I'm trying to figure out that dynamic. I call it my four C's, and kind of the notion of leadership through a kind of a four-pillar approach. If you'd like, I can talk to you about those in a little bit more
Yeah,
detail.
please do.
So the four C's is, especially for leaders, and this actually applies in industrial tech and med tech, is I look for four C's. Strategic clarity. And if the strategy is not clear, digestible, clear, then that needs to be addressed. Then it's organizational capabilities. It's a function of capacity and capabilities, both. If they're out of whack, you can see that they need to be addressed. The next one is compliance with the strategy. In other words, are the teams and folks doing the right things according to the strategy? If they're not, get that back in check. And the last one is connectedness. In other words, are these organizations well connected with the goal, the purpose, the value proposition, what we're trying to get to, and what the teams are doing? If any of those four C's are out of whack, I think leaders have to really address those in earnest.
Mhm.
And as a leader, I always subscribe to if the trusted leaders um, have the best followership and basically have the biggest impact. And my definition of trust kind of aligns with what the Ernst and Young folks determined was, humanity. You have to be a decent person, right? The next one is you got to be competent. In other words, you got to know what you're doing and be able to demonstrate that consistently. The third one is you have to be reliable. In other words, your word means something. Golden rule: say what you mean what you say, do what you say you're going to do, and do it well. And the last one is that the connection, in other words, the communications, those things have to be a part of it. So, that four kind of quadrant piece of leadership and trust, those themes work pretty symbiotic. And I think leaders that manage those dynamics well tend to do well in terms of recruiting good talent, having big impact, having organizational impact, and quite frankly, are the most sought after leaders.
Yeah, that sounds like a little bit better broken down than what I'm used to, which is trust is character times competence. So very, very similar, but a little bit, teased out to make sure that things don't get left behind.
Yeah, to that degree, I think that formula makes a lot of sense. The character and competence it does. I like the other two dimensions
Right.
because it speaks to you as an individual and kind of your ethics and kind of your authenticity, and then also your ability to communicate well with teams. And as I started out with, because leading is so cross-functional in nature, the better you are at navigating that cross-functional domain, kind of bridges and connective tissue, the better you are at that, I think the more impact you can be as a medtech leader.
Mm. Could we jump into each of those C's just to get a better understanding of what each of those encompass?
So for the C, the first C is what I call strategic clarity. Clarity being the
Well, we'll
C.
start there.
Yeah. So the clarity there is a strategy compelling? Is it realistic? Is it within the feasibility realm of the organization? I'll give you an example. The last organization that I ran, I like the framework that they used at the time was called Play to Win. I believe that the P&G folks, coined this and used one of the business schools to kind of formalize it. But it's a series of feasibility questions where you have the right to win, where you have the technical feasibility, where the systems are in place, which markets, and what's the value proposition to win. I'm oversimplifying it, but I like that construct because it's very clear. And once you put the rigor into it, it actually, puts a pretty robust strategy. And these are things that you need the leadership team to put the rigor, the data, the pressure testing into it to make sure it's rigorously done and credible.
Have you heard of the acronym SMART?
Smart, like smart goals, that's strategic, measurable,
Yeah.
achievable, realistic, and yes.
Yeah, so very
I believe
similar.
I think that comes afterwards. I'll tell you the reason why.
Okay.
It's a good question, right? So after you have your strategy developed, then there's the strategy deployment. In other words, how does that strategy actually get deployed? There are lots of different models. The one I like is the Hoshians, or X matrix, which basically helps you define with a good deal of rigor what your 1, 3, and 5 year goals are. And the 1 year goals become goals and objectives that are use smart metrics and are applied to the people's incentives. What I like about that is because it breaks it down as, okay, what are the ones that here and now goals, your 1 year goals? What are the intermediate goals? What do you need to be putting in place to do that? And what are the 5 year goals, the longer term goals? And the way the construct of that is, it actually makes clear as to, it has a form of a racy into it, who needs to be informed, who needs to be consulted with, who needs to be consulted with, and who's actually accountable and who's responsible. So you've got that. But the 1 year goals becomes the basis of what your goals and objectives are, and you use smart metrics to put those in place.
Yeah.
As a little bit more of a dimension to it, I generally like to use, especially for the leadership team, kind of a 3 to 5 goal target for setting goals and objectives and smart metrics, of course, with these. And there's 3 that are kind of performance related to their function. There's one as a personal development. The other one is how do you develop the function better? But each of those have smart metrics assigned to those that helps, align the organization. And I think that if you follow, strategic clarity in terms of what the strategy is, then the deployment, and then actually bringing that down to goals and objectives and incentives, that creates a really robust connection between strategy and execution.
Mhm. I want to move on to the other C's. However, there's always start with analyze and then figure out what you need to do in order to fix it. So for the people listening to this podcast, if they want to analyze whether or not their clarity is up to par and where it needs to be, what recommendations would you give to them?
Well, I think it's a good. So one, is always usually a check-in point at most organizations, whether it's annual or if it's a new leader coming on board or there's some sort of a significant change or a merger and acquisition. It's always a good point to check in and see, okay, what were the goals of this strategy, and are they meeting the mark, or has things changed that needs to do that? So you check the existing strategy if there's one in place, and then you see how you're tracking towards it. And if you're missing, then you do the forensics to understand what's causing the miss, and then if the strategy still is robust and still makes sense to pursue, then you make the adjustments to get back on track.
Mm-hmm.
If not, if there's something that's material that's changed, then I think the organization needs to go through, a proper strategic planning session to do that. Now, I think strategic planning, if it's done well, in the onset, it doesn't need to be redone every year. Quite frankly, if it's done well, it usually should be durable for several years. It just needs to have, kind of course corrections rather than, full scale strategic.
I call it tweaks instead of
tweaks. Yeah. They're kind of, minor tweaks, steering, so to speak, rather than, actual navigational change.
turning.
Right. Exactly. Right. So doing those things in the event that something material has happened, either, something performance wise or market wise or technologically wise, it causes you to pivot, then you need to go through, the proper, recalibration of the strategy. But I look for the metrics, how you're performing towards metrics. I look at the organizational dynamics. Are all the functions performing well against the envisionment of the strategy? Or if you think that the clock speed of the organization is matched to what the strategy calls for, there's always some strategies are good, but sometimes they're paced ahead of what the organization is ready to do, and sometimes you need to make that fine-tune adjustments. But I look for the connectivity of it. But first things first, I'd look for the KPIs or OKRs, the objective and key results, and see how things are tracking towards those. And if there's any disconnects towards that, then you make the adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Couple things I wanted to get into is as it pertains to strategy. I find a lot of business books are related to leadership and management, not necessarily strategy. I read a book recently that I thought was really good. It was called Understanding Michael Porter. And Michael Porter is some kind of world-renowned business strategist, and apparently his books are overly complicated to read and understand, which is why they created another book called Understanding Michael Porter. And one of the things that I took out of it, which I found very interesting, is one of the big misdecisions organizations can make is by trying to be the best as opposed to being different. And the way that I understood the explanation is if you're trying to be the best, then you're going to look at your competition and you're going to say, okay, well, they do this, 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 and this. So I am going to do that, and that better. Now, you might be able to do it better, but the reality of that gets blurred in marketing. Whereas if you differentiate, you're a lot more different. It's easier to be able to see the difference between you and your competition, and marketing's ability to blur the reality becomes more difficult. So he says, don't build out wide, build deep. So even if you're the leader in a particular area, keep expanding the difference between what you do and what everybody else does. So perhaps you want to comment on that, or perhaps there's some other book or area that people can go to for strategic development.
I'll have to go back and see. There's a relevant piece of literature that I could recommend. Practically speaking, though, what I would say is there's a lot of good frameworks that are out there that are designed to do essentially a variant of Porter's, forces of, of strategy. Whether it's competition, placement, market dynamics, all those things. And I think most companies have some variant that addresses a lot of the Porter-like forces that are impacted on businesses. I think where a practical strategy comes to place is having a deep understanding of the market and where you have a right to win in that market and where the organization has the feasibility to make good on that right to win.
What do you
So,
mean right to win?
so right to win is a factor. In other words, we've got core competencies that are clearly superior or best in class in the space that we operate in, whether it's technological, delivery, commercial relationships, channel, uh, IP. You've got some competitive edge that gives you a right to win in that space, right? The second part of that is you can deliver on that feasibly. In other words, you can either manufacture it, you can actually develop it, you can commercialize it, you can actually get it to the distribution channels, reach and coverage to get that, and you've got expertise to be able to do that. So you've got the capabilities and the feasibility to do that. The next thing is that what you're offering is clearly a high value proposition for the target audience. It may not necessarily be the absolute best, but it's competitive, certainly competitive, right? I mean, there's lots of cars that are made, but some tend to be more appealing to its target audience versus others. In other words, you've got some sort of value proposition that's really valued by your target market, and you're capable of doing that. So when I'm talking about right to win, is you're kind of covering all of that dynamic. I think the trap, per your statement about trying to be the best, I think it's a bit of a misnomer in terms of the best, so to speak. It's actually just being very competitive because a lot of times being the best comes with extreme costs to it and extreme kind of penalties for being the
That's
best,
true. Right.
right? So and sometimes you got to manage that. More times than not, that you're kind of managing the trade-offs. Like, okay, the ideal light switch is over-engineered. What's a really good light switch, that people are going to really like.
Right.
It's competitive and actually allows us to, bring in profits and reinvest and keep that flywheel going. So I think kind of what leaders have to do is manage is to what's a compelling value proposition that allows the organization to win and allow to kind of reinvest in its organization, reinvest in resources to continue to win in a durable way.
Yeah, to that point, so we're at the FDA group, we're developing a AI technology, and I read another book called The Lean Startup, a very good book. And one of the challenges when it comes to software development is everything is possible. And why wouldn't I do this, that? It's cool, it's neat, it's better, so on and so forth. One of the things they say is if it's not going to drive ROI, then don't do it.
Yep.
Don't do it for the sake of doing it. Do it because it's either going to increase your profitability, your productivity, or the number of customers that you can get.
Yeah, I think that discipline's a good discipline. I think in some organizations they may need to do some things for enabling. In other words, it may not have a direct ROI directly, but it's an enabling
As
technology that
long
allows.
as it's indirect and you
Yeah.
can somehow measure it.
Yep. The measurement sometimes gets tough for indirects, but
Right. Somehow.
yeah, right. It's tough. And the other thing is some things are defensive, right? Think patents. Sometimes you do defensive patents just to prevent people from infringing on you or doing these things. I think what the spirit of the guidance is to be disciplined about really prioritizing things that move the needle for the organizational profitability or growth or share, and have kind of the enough discipline to say, nice to have, but not essential to do that. And that's the biggest things that organizations are going to be facing, is because they're resource constrained, right? And they're hopefully having to battle many good options to think through. So, and what management leaders have to do is make good choices.
Hmm.
The hopefully the dilemmas that they're going to be facing is that they've got to decide between which good choice to make, right? If it's a matter between choices that are discretely different, managers do that. Those are managerial decisions. The tougher ones are the dilemmas where you've got good choices. Which one do you pick? And
Right.
that's what leaders basically have to apply, their own kind of decision models to do so. But hopefully you're in an organization where you've got those type of dilemmas that
Mm.
you've got to go after.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it's a lot easier to make a decision between good and bad versus good and good.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's clarity. So unless there's anything that you wanted to add on to that, could we go to the next C?
Sure. Yeah. Next C is capabilities. Now, this is the tricky one, right?
Okay.
Because the capabilities is, especially if the strategy is different than what the organization has traditionally done. If the strategy calls for either a new skill or a bolstering of a new skill or a new flex of a muscle, that's typically when you've got to make sure, does the organization have sufficient capabilities and sufficient capacity to do that? I was with one organization where we made the intentional shift from kind of a narrow kind of sensor focus to more of a platform focus. And in doing the platform focus, it called for much better operational kind of performance and much better supply chain performance, but much better R&D performance. And those were organizations that were not quite as mature as what the strategy called for. The strategy was compelling and made sense. As a matter of fact, you kind of had to do it in order to have durable growth. But unless you fixed those organizational capabilities, it was going to be a struggle to meet the strategy on a durable basis. If you were to peg the strategy to what the organizational capabilities were at the time, you wouldn't have a very competitive business, right? So in other words, it really is a strategy that's going to drive what the organization is going to go to, and that strategy has to be done through a rigorous and realistic pathway to do so. In doing
Oh,
that, typically that's where you find, okay, do you have the right skill sets, the right capacity, right processes, and do you have, I'd say, the right combination of teams in place to do the strategy well.
mhm. So when it comes to capabilities, sometimes we look at a capability and we say that is something that we need to develop.
Mhm.
And then there's other times where we'll look at a capability and say, we just don't have it, and let's focus on what we do have. So, do you have any insight into when somebody's evaluating their capabilities, should they move towards something else, or should they look to develop that capability beyond where its current state is?
So I look at it as, if the strategy is developed in a way that goes through the rigor, usually it teases out. I mean, in other words, if the strategy is calling for a new technology that you don't have the capabilities of doing, then that strategy is not appropriate for you, right?
Mhm.
But generally, what the strategy is called for is um, probably some level of improvement in strategic capabilities. Generally, there's usually some level of improvements, unless you're milking a business or you've got a very mature business that just needs just to ramp up more so. But in general, what you're looking for is to um, bolster some level of performance in organization in order to get a higher level of, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dog in the background, but anyway,
I can't.
what you're trying to do is to flex on capabilities in order to get some higher performance. I would say generally, then it becomes, do you do it organically just by hiring or building it up? Do you outsource it, or do you partner with somebody to do that? And those are kind of interesting things to consider in doing those things. But usually, the times, at least in my career, the times where we said we just want the capabilities, generally, then that would call into question about the strategy. Personally,
Mm.
in my case, those are usually the cases that we said strategically this may not be a fit because we just don't have it, and of the options to get it sufficiently to do the strategy are not viable. So then maybe we should repivot our strategy.
Yeah. Also, another thing that comes to capabilities is I think a lot of us are very optimistic people, and we want to believe in our ability to execute on what our current capabilities are or develop it. So when a team really needs to look hard at their current capabilities as it pertains to the rest of the market, how do they avoid that bias and not wish cast
Yeah.
something that isn't currently there?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because if as a leader, you want to be able to do it yourself, right? You definitely want to do it organically. Yeah, of course my team can do it, right? You want to do it. I think in the vetting process of doing that, you have to go through, kind of the scenarios. Do you make, buy, partner in doing so? And you do a, pretty objective vetting process to get to that, because if you do that, you ask for the data, you ask for the kind of the justification for it, and then the leader and the the person teams proposing it, then you have to have an honest discussion about saying, okay, what are we really trying to do here? And I think those discussions can be delicate at times, and you have to kind of do them with a great deal of kind of finesse. Make sure that you're not demoralizing your team, but you're also having an honest conversation like, okay, look, this is what the strategy calls for. In practical teams, that means, this type of performance, this regularly, this. Can your team really do that? Can you really, how would your team go from where it is right now to that state of performance to do that? Walk me through that pathway. And you have
Yeah.
those kind of professional, but heart-to-heart discussions about how do you do those things. And a lot of times that elucidates, that kind of teases out the challenges that are at hand. And sometimes, you might say, okay, yeah, they can do it. It's a stretch, but they can do it. Or, if you're on the fence, you might say, okay, we can try it for a little period of time, but if it doesn't hit it by, X period of time, then we're going to have to pivot. Or you just say, you know what, I appreciate the desire to do so, but realistically, this is something that we can't afford to take a risk on. So we're just going to make that pivot. And those are kind of judgment calls that leaders are going to have to face.
Yeah. And I think if we're going to get radically candid about capabilities, there has to have been a lot of homework done in advance in order
That's right.
to build trust. Because I can see it going on both sides,
Yeah,
right? Can you do this? And that person doesn't want to say no, right?
sure.
Um, or they want to say no, but they don't feel comfortable saying no, right? And
Yep,
so I think doing your homework and building a company or an organization that has trust in one another to have those open and honest discussions about everything, including capabilities, is really important. Otherwise, getting right down to the point or where the current state is could be increasingly more difficult.
that's right. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point around being connected and having an honest understanding of what the situation is. Yeah, because I mean, you want leaders that want to, stretch, and not relent. I mean, those are encouraging, attributes. At the same time, you also want, people to say, you know what, as much as I'd love to do this, I don't think we can do that. But
Yeah.
a lot of times, you need to have, a lot of trust and a culture that encourages that, quite frankly. And it's probably a topic that we're going to talk about, hopefully in this podcast. But I think to achieve the culture that you just explained, which I think is a really good one, where you have that kind of just objective and honest understanding of capabilities, the culture has to be in place in order to do that,
Yeah.
right? And so one of those dynamics, right? I think that a culture that encourages active debate, where you can actually have what I call rankless discussions at times, where you can actually have, leaders and others kind of have a rich debate about something and come up with good outcomes without, fear of, political reprisals or penalty of saying those things. But in order to do that, leaders have to create that environment. That's something I rigorously try to do, is to have those types of discussions where you actually encourage debate. Sometimes you have to prod it. You have to kind of,
Yeah.
get it out of folks to do some things. And sometimes you have to do this. You always have to admit when you're wrong. And you have to have that kind of humility of saying, I don't know everything. So that's why I'm asking your opinion, to kind of get to a better outcome.
Yeah.
I also think you need to have teams that actually can operate in that space. If they're all kind of the same ilk and kind of the same kind of approach, and you sometimes don't get the richness of divergent thinking,
Mm.
and you don't have the richness of kind of different perspectives to get to those points. So I think kind of having the teams that have a different perspective of approach towards something is a good thing. I think leaders have to be good at harnessing the energy of that and actually captivating it and putting it into something that actually turns it into a really rich culture. And I think if you do that, the organizations look different. They feel different. When you're walking down the hall, they have a different energy towards them. Um, I was a big fan of what I call gemba walks. In other words, you actually go to where the work is being done. This is it's a lean principle, but essentially I like it because instead of just doing it on the manufacturing floor, you do it throughout the organization. You actually go and you have your walks. Sometimes these are walking meetings, and you connect with folks differently, right? It's not
Huh.
a kind of a classroom setting. It's an actual living dialogue, and in doing so, you're just better connected with the organization. And I think connection, which is the last C, by the way, the connection piece, that's an incredibly important one. And I think leaders can do that from different ways, but usually it requires kind of a pretty good combination of communication approaches to get to that point. It's not just verbal. It's not just written or podcast or blogs or vlogs. It's an embodiment of the culture that you're trying to do, but you do that through multi, omni-channel, so to speak, approaches towards doing that. And the one I like the most was what I call my Gemba walks, where you actually walk and you kind of
You
connect.
spell that?
Gemba, Gemba,
Is that
Gemba.
an acronym?
Nope, it's a. I don't believe it is. I don't believe
Okay.
it. I think it's just it's a lean principle where
Yeah.
you actually go to where the work is being done. I believe it's actually probably of Japanese origin, but you actually go to where the work is being done. But I did my own modification of it, and actually instead of just going to the manufacturing floor, I would go throughout the entire organization and do that. And at first it's a little bit unsettling, probably, like, the leaders kind of walking around, doing, flybys and stuff like that. But then as over time, when you realize that it's a genuine just kind of reach to connect and understand and get to know the teams and have an open dialogue and an invitation to speak. I mean, that's in the last few organizations that I've been in, I've done that pretty regularly. I used to do it with my functions originally, but I do it throughout the organizations now, and I find it to be a very powerful and genuine tool that really helps you to connect with teams.
Well, everybody loves stories. So what would, if you had to try to dig deep into your memory bank and you were thinking about the Gemba walk, is there one that sticks out to you? And what was the result of that particular experience?
So I remembered there's a couple of them actually. There's one at when I was at Philips, and I was tasked with doing a pretty significant launch of an ultrasound system. And I used this principle of a Gemba walk. I didn't call it that at the time, but I used to call it walking meetings, right? So I used to kind of walk around and be with the troops on a pretty regular basis. But it was through there that I actually got a really good understanding of the culture and um, the trepidation it was feeling towards striving for greatness. It sounds kind of quirky, but I just kind of felt the trepidation, like they didn't want to mess up. They didn't want to, take a risk that could backfire. Whereas I was hired to do the exact opposite, was to push them to, to kind of go beyond that. And it's through those walks I really understood where the team was at, and then what I needed to do to move the team to a position of a performance. In order to do that, I had to have a pretty compelling strategy, which we did, a really good strategy. I had to do that, and then I also had to go out on a limb and fight for investment on the strategy to make do. Long story short, it was a highly successful product introduction. To do that, and what I was most proud of, the introduction was essentially the previous introduction was viewed to be not as successful as it was supposed to be. But essentially, I took the same team 10 years later, applied these technologies, and had a very different outcome just by using a different way of kind of understanding where the team was by connecting with them, having a very compelling strategy. The organizational capabilities were largely there. We had to tweak some things there, but then we were extremely good in execution. So we had the capacity, capabilities, we got the investment, and then we were connected, and everybody was extremely compliant. So we
Hmm.
executed exceptionally well.
Yeah. Did you want to go into the other story, or do you think that's
So
sufficient?
the other one was more of a kind of an operational turnaround, a strategic and operational turnaround. And this one had a culture that I'll describe it. It was a play not to lose versus where we need him to go is to play to win.
Yeah.
And those are very different organizational dynamics. So that took a lot of kind of contextual data presentation, contextual from to, discussions. Like we're trying to go, we're not trying to shy away from the points of pride that got us to this point, but get to the next point. That's going to require us to do things considerably different. And here's the reason why. Here's where the goal is, here's what the vision is, and here's where we need to come from where we are right now and improve to this level. And this is the path that we're going to do to get that. In order to do that, we're going to change some things pretty significantly, fairly, but pretty significantly to do that. And then in those dialogues, that's where the Gemba walks put the kind of the town hall meetings and the PowerPoint slides and the fireside chats into more context, right? So when you can have those kind of smaller, intimate discussions with individuals that tended out to be kind of pods of influence, that if you had those kind of discussions, you could actually reach the masses a bit differently than you would just kind of through the normal hierarchical, kind of distribution of information. So I'm a big fan of, kind of walking meetings and Gemba walks and getting out and about with folks. It's harder to do with virtual meetings, but you can still do the same thing with virtual meetings too. You do it differently. I think just the frequency and kind of the kind of onboarding become really, really important. How do you do that? For people that are remote, they need to have a proper onboarding so they get into an organization properly. And then there needs to be some level of kind of right-sized face-to-face. It can't be nothing, and it can't be
Every week.
It doesn't make sense, but it has to be some level of face-to-face where it's kind of funny. Is a dear mentor of mine used to always get on my case for kind of eating lunch on my desk, right? Because I'd always, stack up and always eat at my desk. And he was like, "You're missing out on great opportunities to bond with folks." And I never fully appreciated it. I still don't quite understand it, but there's something magical about breaking bread with somebody.
I was just going to say breaking bread. Yeah.
Right. There's something magical
I
about
think it must go back to our kind of Neanderthal mind.
probably.
Because if you think about, just I was thinking about this today, believe it or not, that if I was living in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, I would feel a certain way. And if I was sitting in the middle of Manhattan, I would feel a different kind of way. And even though I'm having the same amount of conversation with people, which essentially would be nothing, there's some sort of security about being around a group,
That's right.
right? And so I think, breaking bread brings that kind of tribal sense of protection and security.
Yeah, it does. I think it's kind of like kind of a common like human function that you kind of all kind of do at the same time. And in some regards, it's pretty disarming, right? Especially, usually people loosen up and you kind of get a little bit more of a,
Definitely.
kind of an atmosphere to it. And it kind of breaks down some of the
Walls.
kind of walls a bit and does that. So,
Mm.
I wish I was more disciplined in doing it. Quite frankly, I still eat at my desk a lot, but at the same time, I'm more disciplined about being intentional about doing that. Especially, you look for ways to connect with folks, and especially with the people that are in hybrid situation, you have to be very disciplined about doing that.
Yeah. Um, you said the last C was connectedness, and the third C was
Compliance. Are
compliance.
people doing what they're supposed to be doing well?
Well, let's start with compliance, move into connectedness.
Yeah. So the compliance piece is okay. So you've got a compelling strategy now that's robustly done, and you have the right to win. Now you're addressing the organizational capabilities and capacity to do that strategy. The last one is, are people actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, and are they doing it well?
Mm.
Right. So this is where compliance, in a sense that, are they executing on the strategy essentially? And that's a function. That's where your KPIs and your OKRs really become meaningful to see. Are people is the organization keeping pace with the strategy? And if not, where are we falling short, or where are we overperforming, or where can we actually go faster? But I think if there's a disconnect between the aspiration and the actual performance, then leaders, managers have to really understand what it is that's driving that. Is it some level of kind of organizational construct. Is it a process issue? Is it a resourcing issue? Is it a market dynamic issue? Really trying to understand what it is that's preventing folks. And some of it is that you might have a lack of buy-in, right? You know, quite frankly, not everybody might not be on board because it's a big leap or is a different change before what they're used to in the past. And I think what the organization has to do is understand what that is. You know, there's been a couple of times where I had kind of pretty high performing people just not doing as well as what they normally had been doing. And more times than not, what I found out was some of it was just flat out they just didn't believe in the strategy and it was no longer a good fit between the employee and the organization. But a lot of times it was the strategy had changed, but the ability for them to do their jobs well didn't keep up with that change. In other words, either the capabilities weren't quite there, or they didn't have the right data or the right information to do what they needed to do. There was some sort of environmental thing that was in fact impacting their performance. Mm-hmm. So rather than just going and saying, okay, the people are underperforming, you kind of dig a little deeper and say, well, what is it that's causing the underperformance and doing those things? And usually when you do the proper forensics and analytics, usually you find out what the root cause is, then you can address it.
Yeah. Connectedness.
Yeah, so I talked about the gemba walks and stuff like that, but I think this notion about connectedness is probably the secret sauce that makes, good strategies great, right? Yeah. Because people are disconnected. And when people are decisive and moving in an aligned direction, they're far better than something that's, a perfect strategy that's just not well executed. So being connected is really, really important. And it's probably one of the best tools to recruit and maintain talent. That when you join an organization that's tight and it's clicking and it's kind of has this culture that's it's professional, it's hardworking, but it's good, and you guys are aligned. Those are great performing cultures, and usually it's because there's a lot of connectivity in what people are doing. I mean, there are great organizations that people go through the paces, but there are other teams where people are kind of going above and beyond. They're going above and beyond. They're really kind of giving the extra mile and doing those things. Some of it is the strength of the business and the space. Some of it is the function of the leaders that are there and the culture of the organization that's been created. Some of it is the actual people, or some combination of that. But usually, the connectedness piece, I think, is probably the lever that the leaders can impact the most, right? They can, because that's something that's directly tangible to their leadership abilities to do so. And it doesn't always have to be so heavy-handed, but just they're tasked with steering the connectivity of the team. If they do that well, I find that the results are there, the culture's there, the talent's there, the ability to recruit folks, the reputation's there. Yeah, a lot of good things happen.
Sounds like a nature versus nurture thing. So let's assume that it's not all nature and there is nurture. If somebody's struggling with the connectedness piece, what type of advice would you get them? Because at the end of the day, everybody would appreciate an organization that has that connectedness.
So I think the notion of the definition of trust that I gave earlier about the humanity, the competence, the reliability, communications goes a long way with the leaders' impact themselves. I think the other part of it is to make sure there's proper communication channels and ability for people to have kind of a bi-directional connection to the leadership and the troops in a way that's it's both structured, but it's also informal. I think you need to have some level of kind of fluidity in terms of channels of communications to do that. But I think also makes sense is that there's the formal organizational structure, and then there's the people that are in the know. I think the people that are in the know, getting all the people that are in the know on the right side, and that's throughout the organization. Yeah, that's everywhere in the organization. There are people that are in the know, and there are people that are have higher stature, perhaps. But the people in the know, those are the ones that you really need to connect with and make sure that you're on board with. And then I think leaders that make themselves accessible and can explain things in good terms with a good mixture of data as well as good mixture of kind of common sense vocabulary to connect with folks go a long way in making the organization connected. Now, granted, if you're doing a turnaround, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be fun in the sense that because you're really forcing the organization to pivot in a direction that it's not used to. But even doing that, I think that the leaders that are actually very clear about why it's being done, the aspiration where it's being done, how performance is going to be measured, what's going to be valued, and doing that on a regular basis and shadowing the behaviors that does that, right? If you see a disconnect between what the leader does and what the organization's asking, the emperor has no clothes happens really quickly.
Right.
You see that there's a good, connectivity between what is being shadowed by the leader and the leadership team and what the aspirations are. I think that happens, that breeds a lot of connectivity with the organization.
Yeah. Well, for anybody that's listening to this podcast that's been on the podcast before, they understand that when I say we do a lot of preparation for these and we're very intentional, they understand what we're saying because we don't just hop on the podcast and kind of shoot from the hip. With that said, everybody that has been on understands I can tend to pivot. Here, I completely blew up our agenda and just kind of jumped into the thing I found interesting, which was this four C's thing. So we're definitely going to have you back on.
All right, Brad, I'd love to. That was good.
With that said, you did mention there was something that you were hoping that we could get into before the end of the podcast, and we've got 5 minutes left. So do you recall what that was?
I thought it was about the constructs these are the constructs that we talked about. So we covered them in pretty good detail about the four C's and the notions of trust in the kind of the four pillars that I described. So I think we did a pretty good job about going into them. But if there's in the coming minutes, if there's a couple of things that I could leave with,
Yeah, definitely.
right? If we have things, so I mean, I think every leader has to have kind of their own framework that they kind of their go-to about how they look at organizations. For me, it's my four C's, and it's also kind of my notion of trust as kind of guiding principles, and that and kind of I use critical path determinations through an experimental design kind of approach. I was a chemist as an undergraduate, so I look at things kind of in a very kind of experimental design and then solve for that going forward. But I think the other part is for leaders to be understanding the dynamics of the organization in the context of where they want to go. And leaders that actually can be very clear-minded with their teams, of course, in terms of the aspiration, kind of where the chalk line is now and where you wanted to go to, and having a really clear understanding of where to get to that next level of kind of greatness. Do well. They have to have the mechanics of how to do that. They have to have the mechanics of how to do the discipline, but they also have to have the ability to inspire folks on a cross-functional basis. So I look for inspiration, impact, connection, as the real kind of measures of leadership. In addition to kind of the kind of qualifications that you normally get to, but the ones that kind of nowadays with all the dimensions of different demographics, hybrids, and data and bots and AI and all those other things, kind of the management, leadership qualities are, can you thread that complexity, keep people on point with the aspiration, and actually make it a place that people want to work to. I think having your good constructs and your models that you can reference as your kind of your go-tos goes a long way, and it actually helps demystify complexity.
That's great. Well, in the world of so much content and information, and our desire to, aspire to the best version of ourselves, is there any place that you think would be a really good area or resource for people to go and visit to that are on this journey?
So there are two that I'm kind of going through. So there's this notion of negotiation. It's by I think Chris Voss. It says
Oh, that's a great book.
never split the difference.
Never Split the Difference. That's a good
Yeah,
book.
it's actually a very interesting.
I forgot about that book. That's a
Yeah,
great
it's a
one.
really interesting one
Yeah.
about compromise and actually how to negotiate. It's actually a very, very, very practical book, but that's what I like. The other one I'm going through now, as a father of three daughters, is super connectors, super communicators.
Hmm.
That's also got very good practical ways of kind of understanding the discussions that you're having and then how to navigate those, as opposed to assuming that you're having a type of discussion when you really are not.
Hmm.
Right. So that's those are kind of kind of two practical ones. What I like about those is because they transcend role, they transcend professional and private. These are just good common sense things that actually make you a good leader, communicator, father, partner, whatever, whatever. These are kind of just good books that, to kind of go after it. When we get to our next podcast, I'll come back with some additional ones, but those are two that I think that are, pretty good. And the other ones are Atomic Habits,
Yep.
just being, good
It's
discipline.
already it's a new book and it's already a classic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, just these are just good frameworks. I mean, the reason why I like these things because they provide good practical frameworks where you don't have to remember the formula, you just have to remember the framework, and then
Yeah.
you can actually execute upon those things. So
Yeah. It's an easy read that you can implement easily at the same
that's right.
time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
And it's interesting because, and I think a lot of listeners probably understand this by now, but early on, there was such a focus in people's early careers in the professional world about technical capability. And I think one of the things that I came to realize I like to believe relatively early was how communication's half of it, you know? And for those people that are, developing their technical capability, that's great. And keep in mind, communication is half of it. So,
To that degree, um, for folks that aspire to be higher level managers, I got to tell you, my lens that I would look the hires that I would do, because typically I'd have functional people vetting out candidates before they would get to me. So I knew that they were functionally capable of doing the role. So the in order of priority that I would look for would be, are they good leaders? First, are they good business people? Second, and then third, are they functionally excellent?
mm,
The reason why I say this is because at some point, if you're going down the technical excellence, you're going to get to the peak of that, and then that's only going to bring you so far,
mm,
which may be what you want to do, which may be fine. But if you aspire to be a higher leader beyond just kind of a functional leader, then typically business acumen and leadership really becomes more important because you're leading the team as opposed to solving the technical issues or the competency that got you to that point,
yeah,
right? So what I would say is, to your point, and part of leadership obviously is communications is a huge part of that, and EQ in general, right? Your technical piece is getting your IQ, of course, but your EQ, navigating complexity, navigating kind of organizational dynamics, cultures, geographies, that stuff becomes increasingly more important as you get higher up in the organization.
yep, yep, absolutely. Well, Sean, that time flew by.
It
Thank
did.
you
It
so
did.
much for your insight. Can't wait to have you on again. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get new updates, get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time.